Travis, yes, brother. How you doing?
Doing well, my friend.
Good.
How are you?
I'm great. Well,
So,
this is Travis and Ross, and this is Notes On, and we try to do Christ on purpose here. And one of the things we've tried to do with this show, Travis, is talk about the different Christian faiths that we believe are within Orthodoxy. In other words, within the salvation umbrella. And, I've been taking the RCIA classes. They now call them OCIA classes at one of my local Catholic churches because I really wanted to learn about the faith, and I didn't want to have opinions out of ignorance.
yeah.
And I thought it might be fun to just, I haven't finished it, but I've learned a lot, and I thought it would be cool to talk about some of the stuff that I think is real strengths of the Catholic Church and some other stuff that I think will probably prevent me from ever becoming a Catholic. But I have developed a real deep respect and even excitement about going to those classes. And I've really met some wonderful God-fearing, God-loving, joyful people. And that's been really good. So, where do you want to start?
Well, I would just say that it was quite serendipitous that I'm wearing my Thomistic Institute hat. So, I really respect those guys. I've always said that if I converted to Catholicism tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, I would become a lay member of the Dominican order.
Tell me why.
Well, I mean, I say that advisedly because I don't really know exactly how to join the Dominican order. So I say the day after.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what their process is. So they might say, well, you can't join. You have to go through a process. So
yeah.
So let's say I will begin the process of, but the Dominicans, more than anybody else, in my opinion, uphold sola gratia. They are the one, at least the Dominicans I've read, they seem to be the one group of Catholics that uphold the idea that we're saved by grace alone more than all. And of course, they're Thomists. And that I'm metaphysically a Thomist.
Uh-huh.
So since I am Thomistic in my approach to a lot of philosophy and that sort of thing, that would feel at home there. So,
good.
That would be why.
I think isn't joining an order reserved to monks and priests? Isn't that? I don't know how that works.
Our friend Gavin Kerr is a lay member of the Dominican order, and he's married, has children, but he's a lay member. He's not a celibate monk.
Okay.
So you have. I guess he walked us, I think, one time through the tiers, and I think if I remember correctly, he said he's third tier.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, and I didn't even know that until, I don't know, I guess 10 years ago when I really started getting into Thomistic philosophy. I mean, I started reading very broadly and among their philosophers, and maybe it was even reading part of like the bio of Gavin Kerr that I even learned that there was such a thing. I can't remember exactly how I learned it, but I was like, well, if I were to ever join, because I'm a huge fan of the Catholic theologian Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, who, when I was struggling with whether there's even a God in the wake of my wife's death, I read his book, God, His Existence in Nature. And that was just it's a 2-volume work on the proofs for God and the nature of God. And it's just a tour de force. And I continue to consult that book constantly. And then I read his book, The One God, which is a commentary on the first part of the Thomas of Summa. And then I read the next volume of that, which was his discussion of the Trinity. And it was the most mind-blowing, wonderful studies I'd ever done. I just cherish just that time drinking in his understanding of the Trinity. I mean, and he's connecting himself. Obviously, he's in conversation with the whole tradition, but it was just wonderful. And so
the stuff that he brought out on the Trinity, was it specifically Catholic, or would you say that it applies to all Christian faith?
Great question. And I would say that if you call yourself Reformed, which is what I do, I'm a Reformed Thomist, so I uphold the Reformed wing of the Reformation. That's my tradition. And then I'm Thomistic in the sense that I hold to the classical proofs that Thomas defended, as well as his metaphysics. It's simply because his proofs presuppose the metaphysics,
Okay.
But that's simply to say that the Protestant reformers had no interest in changing the doctrine of God. And so the view of God that Thomas upheld, which is really a view of God he inherited from people like Augustine and Anselm. He denied the ontological argument for God's existence, but that doesn't mean that he didn't buy into the conclusion that Anselm promoted. So Norman Guys used to call this triple atheism: Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas. And that view of God that Thomas basically inherited from Augustine, and I think made improvements on it. That view of God, hook, line, and sinker, the essence of God, the existence of God, the Trinity, all of that was bequeathed basically to the Protestant reformers, and they bought it hook, line, and sinker. So that the view of God that they uphold is absolutely the same. There's no Calvinist or Reformed view of the Trinity. There's the Catholic view of the Trinity from the Western tradition, and then there's the Eastern Orthodox view of the Trinity. And there are differences there, but there's no difference in the Western tradition. And the Reformers were Western Christians who inherited Latin Trinitarianism.
So the real basics were in virtually 100% accord then between
absolutely
and Catholic. That's wonderful.
Yeah. So go read what say the Catholic Catechism. Go read what it says about God, and then go read the Westminster Confession of Faith. The view of God promoted in the Catechism and the Confession there's some difference in lingo, but there's the sum and substance of that view of God is there. I mean, it's just the same view of God. And that's important. We don't want to change the view of God that Christians have been defending for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
What the difference is how we're reconciled to that God. And specific matters on authority and ecclesiology. That's where the battle is. The battle is are we obscuring the gospel by saying that we're justified by grace alone through faith alone? Or are they obscuring the gospel when they say we're justified by grace alone through faith and our participation in the sacraments? So,
yeah, fair enough. And what about their Christology?
Well, I mean, I'm a Thomist when it comes to that. They're buying hook, line, and sinker the Chalcedonian formula, and Thomas is defending that using an Aristotelian metaphysic. And I think it works best when you do that. So, for example, there is no distinction between the person of Christ and the nature of God, because God is simple.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a distinction between the person and the human nature, because the human nature is complex. The human nature possesses accidental properties. And since Jesus is fully human, his person, insofar as he's human, has accidental properties. For example, he was on earth a long time ago and he's not now.
Right.
So his accidental properties have changed. So, I mean, so the Aristotelian nomenclature on natures and attributes and all of that stuff, tempered as it is with Thomas's reworking of it in accordance with Augustinian theology, that to me is just it's so rational and yet at the same time preserves the mystery, and it's gorgeous.
That's great. Good. Well, let's start with something I really deeply appreciate about the Catholic tradition. When I visit, when I go to Mass, when I take these classes, when I read the Catechism, and I think about all this, I feel more rooted to church history than I ever have in any Protestant tradition that I've been in. It makes
I mean, I understand you, and it makes me sad, but yeah.
Yeah. I've said this before. It's like for Protestants, church history is John wrote Revelation, and then there was Martin Luther. And it's really sad.
Sure.
Because,
by the way, that's best case scenario. I mean, a lot of Protestants don't know who Martin Luther were.
yeah,
I have a very significant number of people, students at the school that I teach at, when they come in, they're freshmen, and I'll say, we're going to be talking about Martin Luther. And I don't know why they think this, because, we're in the 1300s, 1400s. And I'm like, okay, next week we're going to talk about Martin Luther. They think I'm talking about Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm like, that's a little bit further down the road. That's 20th century. So why would you think? Because they hear Martin Luther, they think Martin Luther King.
you say, no, we're talking about the guy he was named for.
Yeah, we're talking about the guy that his father named himself after and named him for. So yeah. But they don't even know who Martin Luther is.
So that's part of a real grounding that I feel when I'm going to Mass or talking to Catholics. It just feels like it's better rooted than a lot of the Protestant churches I've been to, and that's really a shame, because that is our history as well. They don't have an exclusive claim on that history. Rather, it seems like a lot of the Protestant churches have given it up, like they don't even try to claim it or understand it.
No, the evangelical churches are shallow. I mean, they just are. I mean, I'm not the first to notice this, but it's basically a concert and a TED talk, and that's what the worship service is.
Yeah.
And that is simply not, that is not what the reformers were going for. I think that if you do go into a church where they really are upholding the regular principle, and they are really doing what the church is supposed to do, I think you will feel rooted. And I went to a Greek Orthodox church multiple times when I was doing my deep dive. I went to multiple Catholic masses. But the worship service at my home church is as deep and penetrating as any of those, and if not more so. And I didn't feel at all like by staying Presbyterian that I was losing anything. I thought I was actually gaining more.
Well, there's no reason we should. It's just really strange that so many Protestant churches don't get it. Is your church liturgical in its worship?
Yes. We follow the regular principle, and that means, what the regular principle means is that the scriptures give us the way to worship. And so we are not to add or subtract what the scripture demands of us in our worship. So, for example, in our call to worship, we sing a psalm. Why? Because Paul commands us to worship God in the singing of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Now, there is a debate among Reformed Christians as to what the hymns and spiritual songs means. Now, some people believe he's being, kind of Hebrew, just saying the same thing in three different ways. Psalms are hymns, are spiritual. So I don't believe that. I don't believe that the hymns and spiritual songs is just another word for psalms. So I'm not an exclusive psalmodist. Okay, so there's that. However, he does command us to sing the psalms. Because there's no doubt that we're being commanded to sing psalms. And so what do we do in our church? We sing psalms. That's the first thing we do. And we also have modern songs, spiritual songs, and hymns that we sing in our worship service. So we feel free to follow the regular principle, because Paul says psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. We feel free to bring that into our worship. And we monitor the songs. I've even submitted songs as possibilities, but no, they didn't think it was in accordance with our standards enough. So, and I appreciate that. I did get offended. You are to involve yourself in corporate confession, the sacraments. You're to involve yourself in the preaching and proclamation of the word, invocational prayers, and so forth. So all of that is part of our worship, and it's a liturgical. We recite creedal confessions. We often do the Nicene Creed. We often do the Apostles' Creed. We also recite as a corporate body the Westminster Confession of Faith or the catechisms. We do it all, and we basically adapt our confessional reading with the theme of the sermon. So if our pastor is going to preach, say, from Romans 3 on justification, we may have something from the catechism that describes what justification is. We will have songs that reflect that. Some of the hymns out of the Reformational era, for example, may go with that. And our Old Testament and New Testament readings will often focus on passages that follow that theme. So the entire worship service is focusing on one aspect of God's plan of redemption for us, or what God would have us do. So, yeah, or something about the nature of God that we are reflecting on, his justice, or the Trinity, or the incarnation, which is something God did for us. He incarnated himself. So all those things will be a part of our worship. And if I go to another worship service that's more modern, I miss my church.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Does your church does your pastor teach from the lectionary, or does he choose his own sermon topics?
He chooses his own sermon topics. He usually goes book to book, unless there's a special occasion. So this past week, we ordained a new ruling elder. And on that occasion, that is not just a worship service, it's a session meeting. And so what we do is the whole set, it's a session meeting, but the whole session meeting just is worship. And so we're in Acts now. So he left the book of Acts and preached out of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel addresses false shepherds. And it was an exhortation to our ruling elder, who was being ordained that day, to guard his heart about being a false shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also an exhortation to the church to discern true and false shepherds. And we had already elected him, but this was the formal ordination where we laid hands on him. So at the end of the service, he We laid hands on him, prayed for him. I actually stood up for one of the charges to the congregation. So yeah, that was the way it is. So he'll go topical when we have a special occasion like that. In the Advent season, he'll usually leave a book we're in and talk about Christmas themes. But usually we're in a book. And so right now we're just still in Acts 17.
Uh-huh.
And when he finishes that book, he'll go on to another book. He usually alternates between Old and New Testament. So I would imagine that the next book he preaches from is going to be an Old Testament book.
Do you take the Eucharist every Sunday?
We do. We don't do the Eucharist every Sunday morning, but it is offered every Sunday evening. And so I go to church twice on Sunday. I will go in the morning, but mainly to get the Eucharist, I go in the evening. Now, and that's also when guests, our elders are on a rotation to preach in the evening. So whenever I preach, I usually preach the evening service. I preached this past service. In fact, I preached on the impassibility of God, which is one of the classical attributes that a lot of people in the evangelical churches are abandoning, but I think is very important. And then we did the Eucharist. So on this coming Sunday, which will be March 2nd. So we're filming this before it airs on March 4th. But on March 2nd, we will have the Eucharist on Sunday morning. So we do the Eucharist once a month in the morning time on Sunday, and that means that we will not have an evening service. So that's how we do it.
You and I haven't, all the times we've talked about stuff, I don't think we've ever talked about this. Let me back up a little bit and tell my own story here.
Sure.
When I was still going to evangelical churches, I started to sense, before I knew anything about the Eucharist or the real presence or any of those concepts, I started to sense that I wanted to take communion more than once a month, or once every 3 months, God forbid. And when my wife and I started going to the Anglican church and I started studying it, the Anglican church does the Eucharist every Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to really, really enjoy it. It became my favorite part of the service, along, tied for first with the sermon. And so my question to you is, what is your position on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist? I don't think we've ever talked about that.
Yeah, my view is the Reformed view, and we believe that Christ is really present in the Eucharist. So, but he's not physically present in the Eucharist. He's spiritually present in the Eucharist. But because he is spiritually present in the Eucharist, in a dispositional manner, God is omnipresent, but he's more present in some things than others.
Yeah.
He's more present when the people of God are in corporate worship together than he is in other places in the world. This is what some scholars of Edwards' writings have called a dispositional ontology, which means that it's like a place in the universe is lit up with God manifesting himself here more than elsewhere.
Yeah.
In the way that the Shekinah glory appeared between the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant once a year. And so it is a spiritual presence that is likened unto the Shekinah glory being present in the altar. That Christ is present in the sacrament, so that when I'm feeding on, to quote a line from the Anglican Church, when I'm feeding on the elements with my mouth, I'm feeding on Christ in my heart by faith, and I'm being more and more sanctified in that element, in that sacrament, than I would otherwise be without it. it is absolutely essential for a Christian to take the elements of the sacrament so that they can be sanctified. And anybody who says anything less than that, I think, is holding the sacrament in contempt. And, I'm not going to say it absolutely, but I'm that far away from saying that you probably are not a Christian.
I think
that's how seriously I take the sacrament.
Yeah, and the Catholic Church takes it as seriously or more.
Right.
But of course, they believe in transubstantiation, which one of the things I appreciate about the Anglican Church is that they believe in the real presence, but they don't try to define it any further than that.
Yeah.
Like they just let it lay there as a mystery. And I really like that. One of the general things I feel like I can say about the Catholic Church now that I've, mostly gone through these classes is they seem to take perfectly good ideas and doctrines and add one or two or three layers past what they ought to.
Yeah.
And this, in my mind, is one of them. I don't know, for them, they actually say that Christ is physically present. It changes into his body in every way except for the way it looks and smells and tastes. And I just can't get there. That seems crazy.
Yeah. And you have our friend Thomas Aquinas to thank for that. It was his Aristotelian metaphysics that allowed him to make philosophical sense of the transubstantiation of the elements, because Aristotle had a distinction between essential and accidental properties, or substantial and accidental properties. So I am essentially, one of my essential properties is that I'm in the image of God. That's an attribute of mine that's absolutely essential for me. So if you take away the image, you take away me. But I have two hands. If you cut off one of my hands, you've changed what is called an accidental property, which means that because it is accidental, that means that I can't exist without it. That's what we mean by an accident. It doesn't mean it's a mistake. It just means it's something that is incidental to what you are. And so Thomas argued that at the proclamation or the dedication of the priest, when he gives the blessing of dedication over the elements, the substance changes, but the accidents remain the same. So the taste of the wine is still the taste of the element. It still tastes like wine, even though its substance is blood.
But what causes it to taste like wine if the substance is changed?
That's the mystery of the Eucharist. that's so the logic is that it's possible, at least logically possible, for the substance of something to change and the accidents to remain the same. And you say, well, I've never experienced that before. Well, the Romanist is going to say, yes, that's what makes it a miracle.
Yeah.
That's what makes it a mystery and all of that.
So Travis, we only got like a minute left. So here's something that happened that I was horrified, right? So as careful as the Catholic Church is about us understanding the Eucharist and transubstantiation and teaching how vital it is, and the priest at OCIA classes actually said, everything else can be wrong with the Catholic Church, but I'm going to stay a Catholic because they have the Eucharist. But when it came to COVID and sort of its aftermath, there were a lot of Catholic churches that were only serving the bread and not the wine. And then, and even now, the cup is optional. And I'm like, what? Where do you get that from the Bible? How can you derive that? And I asked the priest that at the OCIA classes, and his answer was basically, well, the church decreed that it's okay.
Right. In fact, if I remember correctly, it didn't become optional until Vatican II. I'll look that up for our next session together. But I think Vatican II is what made it optional. Before that, the laity were barred from the wine, from the blood of Christ.
When Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me," it seems to me that this is both.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and to change that is almost heretical. I was horrified. Anyway, there we are.
Until next time.
Until next time. All right, Travis.
See you, brother.
See ya.